We're jumping right next to the next lecture. Professor Brandon Taylor. Professor Brandon Taylor has come to us from Oxford. And I have to say I was quite impressed by the wide range of specialities of research you have, which I might read to you. It's the global modernism and contemporary art, the history of art institutions, and post-revolutionary Russian art. And from this very wide scope, he will focus today on his view on works of art. And thank you very much for coming, and I suppose we'll jump right into it.
Thank you. Yeah, right one. Okay, good. Thank you. Good morning. I'm interested in the question whether Hans Arp and America were ready for each other in the 1940s and 1950s. The basic plot situation is the arrival of one of Europe's most enigmatic artists in a city that, since the early 1940s, had after all been busy stealing the idea of modern art from its erstwhile European home. And what makes Arp's part of the story interesting is that we don't, in my opinion anyway, yet have a very good understanding of the particular combination of joy and unease that lies near the heart of Arp's project. Its sense of bivalency and mockery, somehow mixed up with a bursting, fructifying form that can be found in much of his work at its startling and enigmatic best. How could Dada, this is the question that I'm going to attend to, do business with nature? And how were these terms, either term, to be understood in the melting pot of post-war America? And again, because of lack of time and so forth, I'm going to begin in the year 1930, when Arp more or less ceased working almost exclusively in wood relief and began to assess his impulse to name his art objects as if they had the character of surrealist poems. Moon Frog, Bird Mask, and so forth are examples of works before 1930. Suddenly, my need for interpretation vanished, he wrote in retrospect, and the body, the form, the supremely perfected work became everything to me. In 1930, I went back to the activity which the Germans so eloquently called Hauereien, or hewing. I engaged in sculpture and modelled in plaster. His earliest sculptures in plaster, such as Torso of 1931, although this is a later bronze version, give a direct hint of what was to follow. Torso might be an upright figure in roughly the classical tradition, but it might also be an escape from it, in seeming to possess a kind of gathering, animate force. In the years following, Arp hewed a group of carvings in plaster that go further in that direction, at the same time as defining his antipathy towards the increasingly triumphalist statements of art concret, abstraction création, and the other groups that he had by now left. The word concrete now being deftly replaced by the more labile term concretion. So that the human concretions, of which we've seen examples already, 1934 would be one and 1936 would be another, carry some significant connotations, notably the suggestion not of static or balanced form, but of process, of growth. A kind of genesis and evolution seem contained within. Concretion signifies condensation, hardening. He goes on, the curdling of the earth and the heavenly bodies. Concretion designates solidification, the mass of the stone, the plant, the animal, the man. Concretion is something that has grown. And then in an extraordinary statement, I want my work to find its humble place in the woods, the mountains, in nature. And this is a statement that, in my view, makes sense of his collages too. Having been used to cutting the paper and so on and beginning to tear them, he says, I tore up drawings and carelessly smeared paste over and under them. I stuck my collages together with a wad of newsprint. I had accepted, so to speak, as he wrote later, the transience, the dribbling away, the brevity, the impermanence, the fading, the withering of our existence. Now, it was surely Arp's good fortune to be invited by the most sympathetic and perhaps best read of all New York artists, Robert Motherwell, to prepare a volume of images, prose and poetry for publication in the Documents of Modern Art series. Motherwell was well educated in European literature and art, and in French writing and art in particular. Now, what is distinctive about this publication, Arp on My Way, Poetry and Essays 1912 to 1947, is not only its rich mixture of poetic and biographical texts, and not only the flavour imparted by its three languages, German and French, of course, as well as the English of the book's publisher, but it was photography that now makes its claim to being a visual technology ideally suited to suggesting how a poetic conception of nature could be reconciled first with the intensity and provocation of Dada, but with the inescapable stasis of the sculptural thing, its brute materiality, its subjection to gravity and light, above all its relationship to the ground. It's startling, I think, to find Arp's 1936 sculpture lying in clover and photographed in no less than three distinct orientations with respect to light and gravity, which is to say, three distinct modes of contact with the ground. The left-hand page shows back and front of the same position. The cinematic implication is clear, that the object is in movement from one frame to the next. Its trumpet-like protrusion facing half up in two of them. In a third it is turned to face the ground, while in a fourth it is fully raised, as if a creature first of all asleep, but with its own power to rouse itself, then slowly elevate its neck and face the sky. And this idea of sculpture that has no dominant or principal mode of placement with respect to its support remains, as far as I know, unique in modern sculpture. One scholar has proposed a typology of bipolar, tripolar, bottle, head, and other forms to convey the semantic richness of art's total production. But I claim that taxonomy by itself is not enough. The photographer of human concretion is the Hamburg-born Rolf Tietgens, who after arriving in the USA in 1939 became fascinated by surrealist conceptions of the photograph that owed actually little or nothing in practice to the radical practices of Man Ray or Boiffard or the experimental writing of the magazine Document. Tietgens writes in the American popular magazine Minicam of the super reality that can be got from looking through the camera lens, inverting objects and truncating them, and so on, and giving the feeling that something previously unknown has sprung into life. Tietgens, for example, would photograph Arp's giant seed of 1936, sometimes titled Plant Organism, to show what his conception of surrealist photography could do. In one shot, the sculpture appears like a large bird-like creature that has paused on its flight and is looking upwards towards the sky. In another, taking advantage of the revolving base that the work has been provided with, he photographed the work from below. That's the one on the right. This one. The sculpture turned against the passing clouds and the sun's glare, such that while one protuberance or bud melts into the fluffiness of the cloud behind it, the other looms threateningly above, darkened and lowering like a sudden change in the weather. And it's this endowment of mutability provided by the camera in a series of further statements in On My Way, and to which Arp himself surely gave his consent, although I've no evidence for it in documents, that is the opening of a relationship between sculpture and the photograph that I think can be said to be, I hate to say it, more European than American, closer to Arp's character, and touching quite nicely on his basic disposition vis-à-vis Dada and nature. For example, we find that the Grand Mir of 1936 has a total of 4 alternative positions on the same base. Actually, there's only 3 there, sorry. 2 of which are from On My Way. The granite sculpture Lunar Armor of 1938 has 3, again, 2 of which are from On My Way. The plaster sculpture known as Interregnum, sometimes known as Shell Crystal, has 4, 3 of which are from On My Way. And a sculpture called Oru of 1953, later work, has 3, and so on. The Europeans in the New York art world seemed relatively receptive to this concept of mutability. We don't want to copy nature, Arp had said, and the statement is reproduced in the Peggy Guggenheim exhibition of 1942. We don't want to reproduce, we want to produce. We want to produce like a plant that produces fruit. We want to produce directly and not by way of any intermediary. Robert Motherwell, in his editorial job in On My Way, did a passable job, I think, in sensing what he believed was Arp's special conception of nature in his editorial preface. Arp is a pastoral artist, he says, quoting Arp's statement that my reliefs and sculptures fit naturally into nature. Then saying that his Arp's process is slow and even as nature's is, carving that has the effect of water run over human stones. No wonder predatory man nauseates him. Referring to Arp's frequent references in his poetry and prose to the mechanical domination of nature to which the Dadas had reacted at the time of the First World War. Motherwell added, his words explode at the workings of modern society. Costumed fraud. The Dadaist in him is aroused, and he writes true poetry, spontaneous and unforced, without desire to be a poet. Now, Motherwell may or may not have known, and I actually don't know the answer to this. I'm asking now a bit more about this conception of nature that I believe is so central to Arp's best work. And that's a judgment that I'll qualify later. In the magazine März for July 1924, number 8 and 9 is called Naski. And which edited by Schwitters and Lisitsky. Nature du latin naski signifie devenir, provenir, c'est-à-dire tout ce qui par sa propre force se développe, se forme, se meurt. Naski signifies becoming, originating, which is to say everything that by its own force develops, forms, and dies. And there are many statements in this wonderful, fascinating edition of März that say things such as, nature herself is oblivious to eternal beauty, the concept of beauty, of course, being one of the standard attachments of the concept of nature. Whereas modern nature, that is mechanical nature, is that which comes from man. We have had enough of the machine, März states. No more machine, emphasized, in speaking of the artistic production of today. That is 1924. Well, now I want to say that this tension, this opposition between oblivious nature and the machine was actually, in essence, goes back to Kant and is a Kantian theme, which is partly to say that it's an opposition, a contrast, which has its origins really in what, in shorthand, would call German Romanticism. Tristan Tzara had already made an observation that Arp, quotes, loved Kant's writing. And that is to say, how much he enjoyed repudiating, as Kant himself did, a merely mechanical conception of nature. Nature viewed as a piece of clockwork whose wheels rotate according to physical regularities, quite apart from human concerns. And since his Zurich days in the Cabaret Voltaire, Arp had gravitated to that idea of nature whose roots did lie in the Romantic past, in Novalis, Schelling, Hölderlin, and others that we all know. But notably in Kant's fulminations against natural mechanism in the Critique of Judgment, which I believe stayed with him in the studio. A machine, Kant had argued, has solely motive power, whereas nature is composed of self-preserving, self-repairing organisms possessing inherent formative power, in which every part is reciprocally both end and means. Now, again, kind of briefly, I guess, in this context, how does ARP use this Kantian idea? Well, if you look at the text entitled The Strasbourg Configuration, a text written in 1931, just at the beginning of his conversion to torn paper collage and hewn sculpture, it's an important text, although it wasn't published actually until 1963, which is why Motherwell presumably didn't know it. ARP says the following: I have 4 natures. You know the eagle has 5 lives and 4 natures. You know nobody can prove to me that I'm not an eagle. Nature is a white eagle. Actually, I have no idea what that means. Absolutely none. He goes on. I have 5 senses, he continues. Sense, and this is the bit I want you to pay attention to. Sense and nonsense. Nature is senseless. And a little later, Dada is for the senseless, which is not nonsense. Dada is as senseless as nature and life. And finally, in a great sentence actually, make way for nature. Make Dada way for Dada nature. Well, in some ways, this idea that nature, the Kantian kind of idea, that nature is somehow inside man, you could argue is not totally inimical to at least some members of the New York School of Artists of the 1940s and 50s, Pollock and so forth and so on. And yet, I say that it's actually very different. And I think that the key to the type of difference we're talking about actually lies in the idea of collaborating, which ARP was very, very, always gravitated towards whenever he had an excuse to do so. So that we begin to try and make sense of sculptures which have a collaborative, or even collages which have a collaborative mode of production. Some of, to me at least, and I just read them in the way that they appear to me, his sculptures sometimes, often want to wreck or to complicate, or at least throw into doubt the presence of a unitary form-giving principle in the shaping of the work. And the result is that the work itself appears to be charged with a kind of what I believe is called anacoluthis, a sort of semantic jumping from one form impulse to the next. The quality is nicely defined by the dictionary as a want of grammatical sequence, the passing to a new construction before the original one is completed. So the very aptly named Marital Sculpture of 1937 is such a work. Of course, it's made by lathe turning for the rounded parts and sawing for the cuts. And as such, it contains a kind of interruption in what promises to be a continuously rounded form, made as if to expose an inside to matter, such as might be obtained by spoiling or wounding one form category with another. Other sculptures, such as the shell crystal, which I've referred to already, of 1938, also contain a slice or section through an otherwise rounded form for purposes of importing uncertainty as to the intentional direction of the work. And I'm surprised to find that this particular feature of slicing or a plane from a rounded work has attracted very little comment in the art literature. There's one small comment by Gideon Velker, who talks about the semi-architectural nature of this technique. Well, I'm proposing that one clue to the functions of this collaborative or semantic doubling of the work can be found in the torn collage of 1946 that was published in On My Way. Oh, sorry, that's not it. But as well as the 3 duet drawings of 1939, of which these are 2, done by Arp and Sophie, of course, that appear on pages 73 and 74 of that publication. Now, given that On My Way was prepared for publication shortly after Sophie's tragic death in 1943, read in a purely biographical way, it's kind of unsurprising that prominence should be given to their partnership in art. And yet collaboration as a technique of forming what I would propose we might call distributed authorship goes actually back to the beginning of Arp's activities, right to the time of the Cabaret Voltaire or even earlier. I don't need to enumerate all the other examples. There are the Cadavre Exquise, done with Dominguez, Sophie Teuber, Marcel Jean and Haussmann in the 1920s, might be one example. The marvelous album done with Alberto Magnelli and Sonia Delaunay at Grasse in 1941 and 1942 might be another example. But my question, and I don't actually claim to have quite the answer, is how are we to describe duet drawings, either of this or any other kind? Collaboration seems to mean 2 things simultaneously. On the one hand, a dilution of intention, a kind of abandonment or ceding of desire that comes with closeness to another person. In this case of Arp and Sophie Teuber. On the other hand, it may be described as the exact converse, the exemplification of a higher or more developed form of will, one that wishes not to dilute but to intensify authorship as a form of delegation or permissiveness, made for the purposes of burgeoning simultaneous form. So I think we might have to say that not presenting a single intentional plan for any particular work, rather complicating it or multiplying it, goes towards a concept of Dada nature, in which form is bursting and fructifying, as I said at the beginning, and yet senseless without being non-sense. Now, I'm going to skip over. Actually, there's a fascinating digression which one day I would like to expand on or to travel along, which involves the relationship between Arp and Gestalt psychology. But we're not going to do that today. No time. I'm also not going to talk too much about the completely other side of Arp's reception in New York, and in my view, a way in which he was not understood properly in New York of the 1950s or 40s, which is as a kind of quasi-classical artist. On the left, you see the page from the Buchholz Gallery exhibition. Actually, it's not 1940, it's later 1949, I think. That's a misprint. And again, you have the absolutely extraordinarily inappropriate installation at the Museum of Modern Art in 1958, which seems to have no grasps, no concept at all of what Arp is trying to do, as far as I can see. And it even extends to the photography in the catalogue. This, contrasted with the Tietgens photographs that I showed you earlier, is a photograph of the same work, or a similar work in that series, Human Concretion, photographed by the Japanese photographer Soichi Tsunami, who was celebrated for this extraordinarily calm and balanced style of very subtly soft-focused photography. Now then, to finish up, I'm going to just revert or digress slightly to the evidence supplied by a certain Charles R. Hulbeck, who's been mentioned once last night. By now, the 1950s, living at 88 Central Park West and practicing as an existential psychoanalyst while teaching at the American Institute for Psychoanalysis, roughly from a standpoint of Otto Rank and Karen Horney, and later the Swiss philosopher Binswanger. Hulbeck is important to us, or valuable to us, for his reading of the American psyche during the years of the country's rapid post-war industrialization. What in a 1943 paper on the creative personality, read before the Association for the Advancement of Psychoanalysis, he characterized as mechanization, collectivity, nationalism, bolstered by a trend towards commercialization, and what he describes as the atomization of the human mind, in which the worker only sees part of the product and is deprived of any possible interest in the product as a whole. In another paper read to the Association on Completeness and Incompleteness in the Human Situation in 1955, he talks about the experience of feeling lost, as you find in Heidegger, of the Sein und Zeit, and in Sartre, and in other reflections from European phenomenology and existentialism on the on the alienation of contemporary man, basically. Now, in the age of the atom bomb, Hulbeck writes elsewhere, the self-satisfied motto of the man of the masses is basically optimistic and pragmatic. Everything is fine and getting better all the time. His religion is progress. The invention of television continues his unshakable optimism, no less than the denotation of H-bombs. He kills and dabbles in art. Wonderful stuff, actually. Anyway, I think we all know now that, I'm sure everybody in this room knows that Hulbeck is none other than Richard Hulsenbeck, who with the Janko brothers, Zara, Hemmings and Hugo Ball had, animated themselves at the Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich in 1916. 40 years on, and Hulsenbeck still wants to insist that Dada practiced negation and was never for museums or for millionaires. And he gives a very interesting assessment of Arp's difference from the main cabaret artists of the Cabaret Voltaire. And this is really quite important because Arp, unlike the other Dadas of that grouping, stood apart. And according to Hulsenbeck's testimony, where was he? Answer, he was in the studio making things. And this is why he's so interesting to all of us even now. He was a Dada, and yet he made things. It's a slightly longer story, but let me end with Arp's own reflection on his situation in and amongst the New York School in 1958. He does his best. The collages, he said, that he made with Sophie Teuber represent the transition, so he claims, from abstract painting to liberated painting, as I should like to call the new American painting. And then, in a statement that switches back to his own theme of Dada nature, the divine dream is a bridge between too much and too little. It's a wonderful formulation. This dream is a fundamental part of my plastic search. And similarly, Sophie Teuber created her luminous dream, and this is the phrase I like, between coming into being and passing away. And you may have noticed that I've tried to present this idea of becoming in Arp's work without recourse to the standard language of biomorphic, organic, etc., which I believe is not the terminology we want. Well, by the time that Hulsenbeck leaves America for Switzerland in 1969, he'd fully recognized his incompatibility with America. At heart, I feel unhappy when I have to function well, he confesses. And I more and more became aware of the fact that functioning well is the sickness of the American civilization. Apologies to all Americans. Which is just about to kill the remaining stock of personal freedom and spontaneity. I want to go back to Switzerland and to some kind of chaos, he says. Not a chaos that kills, but a chaos that is the first step to creativity. And as Hulsenbeck had already written in his Memoirs of a Dada Drummer, and in spite of the fact that Arp, actually, as I've said, was never a Dada drummer, exactly, Hulsenbeck writes, Dada never really existed in America. Dada, the laughing, weeping, half-cynical, half-blustering theorem, devoid of system and even substance, this last bon mot that was sucked up along with leftover coffee in Zurich's Odeon and Bellevue, has pathetically little to do with a way of life that aims at material perfection. Dada, he says, cannot exist in America. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
There we are.
Question, because we have some minutes left, more or less, to organize our coffee, because the next lecture of Eric Robertson should take place. Oh, sorry.
Just before we finish, sorry. This, of course, is the well-known photograph of Arp, Richter, and Hulsenbeck with one of his a painting of his of 1950. Oh, sorry, I'm happy to answer questions very briefly.
I was fascinated by your discussion of the role of photography in shedding a particular, very distinct light on some of those works. And I was just wondering, you seemed to set that apart from the role of photography in journals such as Document. And I wondered to what extent that distinction is entirely justified. Because it seems to me that photography there does also play a very key role in shedding new and disturbing and alienating sometimes light on otherwise familiar works.
Yes, a distinction does need to be made. Well, you know, I'm just trying to say really in shorthand and in brief that Tietkens, this guy who I mentioned, is not a document type. He really isn't. He's just a guy who's interested in what he can do by way of being a surrealist, for goodness sake, in the 1950s. I mean, what's all that about? He's a late comer to a kind of popular version of surrealist photography, you know, as you might find in magazines such as Lilliput, or you know, almost any mass market photographic magazine of the late 1940s and 50s had quite a bit of this kind of surrealism in it. That's the point, really. But thanks for the question. No? Okay. Thank you.
Hi, you describe the presentation of the ARP show, or ARP's work in the Museum of Modern Art as inappropriate. I was wondering, could you somehow, in a short form, describe how would you have done it differently? And it's not. I don't disagree with you. I was just curious because I noticed that as well. And yeah, what would you do differently?
Well, I probably wouldn't have had an exhibition at all. I mean, you're faced with a paradox of an artist who doesn't believe in exhibitions, and as I tried to say, a stable orientation or a single orientation for his sculptures on the one hand, and you have this kind of rather static, spacious, rather unappealing sort of rigmarole of one sculpture, then another sculpture, then another sculpture on bases. It didn't look right to me, and as far as I could tell, it had no connection whatsoever with the writing that ARP supplied for the catalogue for the show, by the way, which was actually really pure, you know, proper Hans Arp or Jean Arp writing about nature. Similarly, the texts by Gideon Velker and Robert Melville, excellent texts, actually, completely at odds with the nature of the show as far as we can tell. Okay?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say, and maybe this is something that I should have drawn out more in the paper, but I feel, the way I feel is that what that 58 installation looked like was a manifestation of Barr's reading of art, right? That it is that sort of forced, over top, top down sort of imagination of what that typological art shape is, and so in that sort of over exaggerated curving wall or whatever, it's sort of.
Right. Well, that last slide, that fascinating last slide you showed from Barr's draw, actually proved in a way my point.
Right.
That, and probably yours as well, that Barr's conception of ARP was that of a sculptor who was addicted to a certain type of shape. Well, that's my point, that shape is not the issue. It's the sense of not being the right shape or not being the finished shape, the sense of several shapes happening at the same time. That's what I believe that him to have been doing as an artist.
Becoming the shape.
Becoming rather than naturans rather than naturata.
Interesting to know if any of the rotating bases were used at MoMA. Does anybody know?
Yes, it would. It would be very good, interesting to know that.
Probably not.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you.